Richmond, a charming capital of Virginia, woke up to a peaceful Saturday. The sun shone over the tree-lined streets of the suburban Heights neighborhood where Emily and John Morris lived. The couple's home, with its well-kept garden and inviting porch, seemed a picture of stability and happiness. Emily and John Morris were the perfect example of an ideal life. Married for 5 years, they suggest they have everything they could want: a comfortable home, a stable marriage, and a welcoming community. But behind this perfect facade, something was about to change. Emily, 32 years old, was a woman dedicated to her family. She worked part-time as a teacher and spent the rest of her time taking care of her home and her husband. John, 35, was a successful lawyer, known for his commitment to his work and his reserved demeanor. The balance in Emily and John's lives began to be destabilized with the arrival of Sarah, Emily's younger sister, who recently moved in next door. Sarah, 28, had just separated from her ex-husband and was looking for a fresh start. Sarah had a captivating manner, and her natural charm made her stand out in any environment. She soon fit in with the neighborhood and, of course, began spending more time with her sister and brother-in-law. At first, it was an occasional visit for a coffee or a quick chat in the garden. However, as the days went by, Sarah and John began to spend more time together. At first, Emily saw these visits as something positive. Sarah asked for support and companionship, and John was just being a good brother-in-law. However, what seemed like a kind gesture began to turn into something more sinister. Emily noticed that John was increasingly absent. He began spending more time outside the house, apparently working late, but his behaviors began to arouse suspicion. Conversations between Sarah and John, which had previously been friendly and discreet, began to become more frequent and discreet. John's behavior began to change. He seemed more distant, less interested in the conversations that had previously mattered to him. Emily tried to ignore the signs, but the growing tension was palpable. The scene seemed calm during the day, but at night, Emily's restlessness grew. She felt a shadow hanging over her marriage, a feeling that something was wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As April progressed, the weather in Richmond began to heat up, and the tension in Emily and John Morris' household also intensified. Sarah, with her natural charm and disconcerting ability to attract attention, had become a constant presence in John's life. Sarah, Emily's sister, knew how to use her charm to insert herself into John's life. She not only reached out to her brother-in-law, but did so in a way that awakened feelings in him that he had never expected to feel. Sarah started going to Emily and John's house more often. At first, it was just dinners and casual conversations. However, soon the meetings began to last longer, and the topics of conversation became more intimate. Sarah was interested in John's concerns and the frustrations he faced at work. Sarah's involvement with John began subtly. She listened attentively and offered advice, being supportive and understanding. John, who felt overwhelmed and misunderstood, began to find comfort in his sister-in-law's words and touch. One night, Sarah showed up at the Morris house for an unexpected visit. Emily was out attending a school event. Sarah and John were alone in the living room. The atmosphere was different that night. Sarah, wearing a light dress and with a provocative look, sat next to John on the sofa. The physical proximity and intense gazes began to create a charged atmosphere. Sarah knew exactly how to position her body and use her words to elicit a reaction from John. She was playing a dangerous game, and John was increasingly ensnared. Sarah started to touch John's arm casually, but the feeling felt more intimate than usual. Their smiles were longer, and conversations became more personal and full of tension. John, who had always been faithful to Emily, began to feel confused by his own emotions. John, despite knowing he was going against his own principles, couldn't help but grow attracted to Sarah. The line between friendship and something else had blurred, and desire was taking the place of rationality. At the end of that week, John and Sarah started seeing each other more frequently. They began eating lunch together and enjoying each other's company and activities that were previously reserved for Emily and John. Sarah took every opportunity to create a deeper connection with her brother-in-law. Each encounter became one step closer to pushing the limits. Sarah, with her charm and skillful manipulation, was leading John down a dangerous path. The seduction was in full swing, and the tension between them was almost palpable. As the days passed, the relationship between Sarah and John continued to deepen. They began to share secrets and open up to each other in a way that John had never done with Emily. The attraction grew, and with it, John's sense of guilt and confusion. Sarah's seduction wasn't just a matter of physical attraction. It was emotional manipulation. John was losing the ability to distinguish between what was right and what was wrong, and desire was becoming a dominant factor in his decisions. The month of April was coming to an end, and the atmosphere in the Morris household was charged with tension. Emily felt like something was deeply wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The signs were subtle but cumulative, and his restlessness turned into constant worry. Emily, desperate to understand what was happening to her marriage, began to notice details she couldn't ignore. Small signs, like secret messages and strange behavior, were starting to form a disconcerting pattern. Emily began to notice that John often left the house under the guise of work meetings, but his excuses seemed increasingly vague. Night outings had become more frequent and less justifiable. She also noticed messages on John's cell phone that were quickly deleted, and this only increased her suspicions. Emily didn't know how to confront John without concrete evidence. His feelings of distrust were becoming almost unbearable. She needed a way to confirm her suspicions and, unsure of how to proceed, decided to install a hidden camera in the living room. On a day when John was out for a meeting and Sarah was out shopping, Emily got ready to set up the camera. She chose a discreet location where the camera could capture activities in the living room without being detected. With the device installed, Emily sat and waited. What Emily didn't know was that what she was about to discover would confirm her worst fears. The camera she had installed was not just a simple device. She was about to become the silent witness to a devastating betrayal. Over the next week, Emily monitored the camera recordings whenever she had the opportunity. Initially, the recordings only showed the normal routine of the house. But as the days went by, something began to change. Sarah and John began to appear more and more in the images, and the way they interacted was far from the behavior of ordinary brothers-in-law. The recordings showed moments that Emily never imagined. What seemed like casual, harmless encounters turned into overt displays of affection and intimacy. Sarah and John were together much closer than Emily had realized. In one specific recording, Emily saw Sarah and John talking on the couch. The words exchanged were soft and the touches were discreet, but the intensity of the gaze and the physical closeness were unmistakable. In one particularly awkward moment, Sarah and John were hugging each other, and the look of satisfaction on John's face was clear. Emily watched with a heavy heart as the reality of her situation unfolded before her eyes. The betrayal was being revealed in every minute of the recordings, and the feeling of pain and helplessness was almost unbearable. After watching the recordings, Emily felt a mixture of anger and sadness. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man she had married, and the sister she had trusted, were clearly involved in an intimate relationship. The secret was out, and Emily felt like her world had collapsed. The trust he once had in John and Sarah has been broken beyond repair. What was once a promising marriage was now plunged into a whirlwind of betrayal and deceit. After days of anguish and indecision, Emily decided it was time to face the truth. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, and she knew she needed to confront John and Sarah with the evidence she had collected. With a heavy heart and a confused mind, Emily prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation. April 25th started like any other, but for Emily, it was a day of confrontation. She knew that the next few hours would be decisive and that the truth she had hidden in the shadows was about to come to light. That morning, Emily waited for John to leave for work. As he left the house, John mentioned that he had an important meeting and wouldn't be back for lunch. Emily knew Sarah was home, so she decided it was the right time to act. Emily was determined. She had the evidence in hand and was ready to face reality, no matter how painful it was. The revelation of the secret was about to change everything. Emily waited until John left, and then went into the living room where the camera was set up. She began preparing the television to show the recordings. Heart beating fast, Emily reviewed the images and selected the most compromising excerpts. With the recordings ready, she prepared for Sarah's arrival. The tension in the house was palpable. Emily knew she needed courage to face the truth and confront Sarah, the woman she considered a sister. Every moment that passed made the situation seem more unbearable. At around 1 p.m., Sarah arrived home after her shopping. Emily met her at the entrance and, with a cold and determined tone, asked Sarah to sit in the living room. Sarah, seemingly unconcerned, agreed and followed Emily. Sarah entered the room without suspecting what was coming. The look of confidence on her face was about to turn to shock when confronted with the truth Emily had been holding back. Emily turned on the TV and started playing the recordings. The images began to unfold. Sarah and John talking, laughing, and then showing moments of intimate closeness. Sarah initially looked confused, but as the scenes unfolded, her face began to show signs of embarrassment and guilt. The beginning of May brought with it a sense of desolation for Emily. The confrontation with John had left deep scars, and the atmosphere in the house was filled with an oppressive sadness. What seemed like the end of a painful chapter was about to turn into something even darker. With the confrontation still fresh in Emily's mind, the feeling of sadness and uncertainty was almost unbearable. The atmosphere in the house was filled with a deep sadness, but what was coming was something Emily could never have predicted. John had left the house, but Emily's emotional wounds were still raw. She spent the next few days in a state of constant anguish, struggling to deal with the pain and decide what to do with her future. As Emily tried to deal with her own grief, fate was about to intervene in a tragic way. The emotional chaos surrounding his life was about to turn into an even greater tragedy. That evening of May 3rd, Sarah had met with John for a talk. They were in a nearby park, away from prying eyes and with the night sky as a silent witness. The conversation that began as an attempt to clarify the situation quickly turned into a moment of increasing tension. Sarah and John were at a breaking point. The conversation that began with the intention of finding answers quickly turned into a confrontation filled with emotion and despair. During the discussion, repressed feelings and guilt began to surface. Sarah and John, both struggling with the weight of the betrayal and the fact that their actions had caused so much pain, began to fight. The words became sharper, and the emotions became more intense. The meeting in the park, initially planned to resolve outstanding issues, turned into an emotional explosion. The accumulation of guilt and frustration was about to lead to a tragic outcome. In a moment of desperation, Sarah made an unexpected move. She took a small knife from her purse, a gift from a dark past, and threatened John with it. John, scared and confused, tried to calm the situation, but panic took over. What was a simple encounter turned into a deadly confrontation. Sarah, overcome by despair and guilt, made an impulsive move that irrevocably altered the course of events. During the struggle for the knife, an unexpected movement caused the blade to cut John. He fell to the ground, bleeding, and the reality of what had happened began to set in. Sarah, shocked and remorseful, tried to provide first aid, but the severity of the injuries was evident. The tragedy unfolded under the dim lights of the park. The desperate struggle and unintentional accident resulted in a fatal outcome. What had begun as an attempt to resolve a complex situation had now turned into a scene of despair and tragedy. Sarah, panicked, called emergency services, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. John was seriously injured and, despite the efforts of paramedics, he was unable to survive. The arrival of paramedics was unable to reverse the tragedy. John died at the scene, and Sarah was taken to the police station to be questioned. The outcome of the night brought with it a new wave of pain and confusion. When Emily found out what had happened, shock and sadness overcame her. The tragedy had ripped away any trace of normality in his life. The loss of John, combined with the revelation of the betrayal, left Emily devastated. The tragedy not only marked the end of a life, but also the beginning of a period of mourning and reflection for Emily. What had been a betrayal and a confrontation turned into a tragic event that shook his life to the core. John, Sarah, and Emily's story ended on a note of pain and confusion, with the impact of the tragedy reverberating through every aspect of their lives. Loss and betrayal were intertwined in a way that could never be undone. The tragedy brought with it a new reality, marked by pain and loss. What began as a case of betrayal and confrontation turned into a tragic event that redefined the fate of those involved.